You're about to discover everything you need to know about the new cruise ban put in place in the United States. I'm Gary BEMAGES. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. On the 9th of April, the CDC in the US, which is the Center for Disease Control, issued a pretty strong ban on cruising with a whole lot of terms and conditions that the cruise industry has to address and put in place before they will even consider lifting the ban. So what I'm going to do is try and unravel that and explain what it means. I'm going to talk about how long the ban is looking like it's going to go on for, the reasons for the ban that they stated in their document, and thirdly, the 7 things the cruise lines have to respond to and get approval from the CDC before they will even consider lifting the ban. And some of those are pretty big changes. First of all, let's take a look at just how long the ban is on for. What they've said is there's 3 possible scenarios, but all of them look like cruising won't happen for a pretty long time. The first one is probably the one that suggests this could go on for the longest period of time, and that is what they're saying: until COVID-19, until the outbreak in the US is no longer deemed a threat or risk to public health, the ban will stay in place. The second scenario is if the CDC decide that they're going to change or lift the ban for some reason. The third one is probably the most interesting because it puts in place more of a time scale. And what that says is if none of the above have happened, so the public health threat hasn't been lifted or they haven't changed the notification for some reason, then cruising can recommence after 100 days. So that takes us through to Saturday, July the 18th. So just to recap those 3 scenarios, and what they're saying, it's the quickest of these 3 to happen. First of all, if COVID-19 is no longer ruled to be a major threat to public health, i.e. that general advisory is lifted. Secondly, unless they make some changes and decide on an earlier date as the CDC. Or thirdly, if after 100 days neither of those have happened, then cruising could theoretically recommence, subject to the cruise lines addressing those 7 things I'm going to talk about. So we're looking like a good couple of months that cruising is already banned in the US and US waters. So why have they done this? First of all, what they're saying is they believe that cruising is a risk to bringing and spreading the virus around the United States. The second thing they say is they don't believe that the cruise industry has really done enough to stop the spread and deal with the outbreaks when they've happened. The third thing they say is they also believe that the cruise industry is relying too heavily on resources and the medical operations within the United States to deal with the outbreaks. There are 7 things that they have laid out that are really specific that the cruise lines would have to convince them on before they're even going to be prepared to look at return of cruising. Well, the first one is around the screening and monitoring of both crew and passengers. And they do talk about, they also want to understand the frequency of it. So what it sounds they're looking at is not only the embarkation process, how do they screen crew and passengers coming on, but also they're implying that they're looking for more ongoing testing during the course of a cruise. What's also really, really important is they do talk about temperature checks, but they also talk about testing and the ability of cruise lines to test, and they talk about medical screening. So certainly my take from would be is that temperature screening alone is not going to be enough. They are implying that there's some form of testing going to be required, and certainly much more in-depth medical screening required. So they're looking for proposals on how they're going to do that, and also the facilities they're going to have on board and the process that they're going to have on board to be able to screen and test passengers and crew. The second thing which really struck me is also what they're saying is they want to understand how the cruise lines are going to deal with any outbreak. It's really making the cruise lines be able to deal with outbreaks and treatments. So for example, they do talk about if there's an outbreak on board, the cruise line has to be able to deal with it themselves without relying on any resources on land. So they're talking about if an outbreak comes, there would have to be, for example, a hospital ship where the infected patients are moved to. There'd have to be a quarantine ship where people who've been exposed or potentially exposed are moved to, and there'd have to then be a residence ship where people dealing with the outbreak, or I guess people who are not infected or don't have to be quarantined, are. So they are talking there, either there have to be dedicated ships for that role which can be deployed, or there have to be plans that other cruise ships can be sort of moved in to deal with that. What they're saying is if there's an outbreak, you have to find a way of dealing it by also dispersing crew and passengers across 3 different types of ship facilities. The third thing they talk about is they also want to understand the isolation, the quarantining, and what I thought was very telling is the social distancing processes on board. The fact that they mentioned social distancing I found very interesting because it kind of implied that they were talking about ongoing operations. How are you going to make sure that there's more space, passengers aren't crammed together? And we've already seen some indications, for example, some of the Asian cruise lines talking about introducing more social distancing when they can go back. They were talking about things, for example, about only letting the theatre be half full. And so it does sound like they're asking the cruise lines to create much more social distancing. And as we know, at the moment, the model is about getting lots of people on board, making ships really, really full so that they sail with lots of people on board because that's the revenue model. But it does seem to me that they're implying there has to be more social distancing on cruise ships. So it's going to be really interesting to see what that actual model looks like and how they address that. The fourth thing, which is also, for me, feels like a really big change, is they're also saying they want to understand the medical facilities, how many doctors, how many ventilators, how many isolation beds, isolation wards are going to be on board. They do specifically talk about there needs to be more resources on board, and they do talk about there needs to be more equipment on board. Now, medical centers at the moment on cruise ships are really designed as a way of stabilizing people before they can get them off. And this is a really fundamental change because they're effectively saying the medical center needs to be turning itself into almost more of a hospital as such, with the ability to deal with infected patients, isolate them, have ventilators, and probably much more doctors on board. So that does seem like a significant change that they're looking for. Again, it links back to that point where they don't want any cases to be brought on land. The next area was around repatriation. What they're also wanting is plans on how they will repatriate crew and passengers if there is any issues. And what they're saying is has to be done all privately. So it has to be privately funded medivacs if they do ever need to medivac anybody rather than using the Coast Guard. They have to use private transportation, chartered flights, transportation which can be isolated specifically for the crews, and the whole process for moving people off the ship if there are issues. They are saying that you can't use commercial flights or move people through, I guess, airports in the usual way, because they do talk about what the process would be for ensuring that no one else is exposed in the sort of the chain to get people home. Also, they want to know a lot around the cleaning protocols and then the disinfecting protocols if there ever are an outbreak. And that is probably one of the things the cruise lines will be able to answer in some ways the easiest, because they have already instituted many of those during the whole build-up, and also they did have protocols in place for norovirus which have been ramped up. So that's probably actually one of the easiest ones for them to do. And the other one that they've got is significant increases in the way that there's monitoring and tracking of people on board the ship with different types of illnesses, and there's some daily and some weekly reporting. And what I thought was very interesting is they are specifically calling out a number of different conditions, one of which obviously is respiratory, influenza-like symptoms, pneumonia, and then very specifically COVID-19. So this new change from the CDC, the no-sail cruise ban, is a pretty dramatic document in my view. It certainly implies that cruising is going to be shut down well into July, if not even longer, because they also have to be satisfied that not only is the COVID-19 spread on land under control, but also they have to be convinced that at least those 7 things, and there's plans and ways of dealing with them. And some of them, to me, imply quite big changes into the way that cruise ships operate, how many people they have on board, the facilities they have on board. And it does seem to me that there's going to have to be some real fundamental structural changes as well. So that's the latest on updates. I have a whole other series of different questions and issues related to the shutdown of cruising. Please watch another one of those now. And I'm also trying to answer as many questions as people are sending me. Of course, one of the most important messages of all at this time is that it's really important that you stay home, stay safe, stay well, and keep looking after yourself and your family, as we do eventually dream one day of being able to go back traveling. And of course, for those of you who want to and love, like me, to be able to go back cruising.